Well, it's official. Max Verstappen has a new teammate. Isack Hadjar has been promoted to the Red Bull team, with Liam Lawson set to stay on in Racing Bulls, and Arvid Lindblad joins him, stepping up from Formula 2, with Yuki Tsunoda taking a year out next year, remaining as Red Bull's reserve driver. Well, to react to Red Bull's new driver lineup with me is our F1 editor, Lewis Larkham. Lewis, I think this was probably the worst kept secret in Formula One. Obviously, Isack Hadjar has made a great impression, and there's been lots of talk of him joining Max Verstappen next year. But let's just get some initial reaction to the decision. Is this the right move for Red Bull to push Isack into that very, very difficult second seat in Red Bull?
Yeah, shock horror. This the news we've all been expecting for, I think, weeks, if not months. This was seemed on the cards for a long time now. Obviously, Yuki struggled to make an impact alongside Max Verstappen at Red Bull this year, having only taken that seat 3 races into the season. Obviously, replacing Liam Lawson, who had that nightmare 2 race stint alongside Verstappen. I think it's a no-brainer really for Red Bull. At this point, we've seen they stood by their word. They gave Yuki the rest of the season to sort of prove himself, and they've seen signs of encouragement in the recent weeks, but really it's just not been good enough. It's not been to the level required, and it feels a bit like the damage had already been done. Similar to previous drivers, he's got into a negative spiral, and it's very difficult to recover from that. Hadjar is the next in line for the seat, and he's had an incredible rookie season, including that outstanding podium, let's not forget, at the Dutch Grand Prix. Had a really tough start in F1. Obviously crashed out before he even started his debut race in Australia on the formation lap to the grid, and was in tears at that race. But the way he's recovered from that and bounced back, I think has shown real mental strength and resilience, and that's something that is obviously required at being Max Verstappen's teammate at Red Bull, and all of the the spotlight and expectation that comes alongside that. And he's shown this season throughout the year. He's been consistent. He's been rapid. He's scored some brilliant results, and he's learnt quickly, and he's bounced back from those mistakes. So yeah, as I said, no brainer. I'm not surprised to see Hadjar make that step up. Also, obviously the big question here is, can he avoid the sort of same fate that those drivers before him have had, particularly Lawson and obviously now Yuki Tsunoda. But the rules reset in 2026 does kind of give that perfect opportunity for a clean slate in the second Red Bull seat. It's been seen as a poison chalice for so long now, but he will arrive fresh off the back of a brilliant season. He'll be full of confidence, and Red Bull will be hopeful that that fresh start, they can kind of have a clean slate, and he will hopefully be able to perform alongside Max. That's what they will be hoping for. They obviously believe in him. They brought him in. They've nurtured him through the program up to Red Bull, and they believe he has what it takes to perform alongside Verstappen, and has the raw speed, as Lauren Meckies in the press release referred to. He's ultimately got that raw speed, they believe, and I think that's the key thing from Red Bull's side.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been a really interesting year for Hadjar. Obviously, as you mentioned, he had that disastrous crash out in the opening lap of the Australian Grand Prix, but that has obviously played into how he's managed to handle himself as a driver. I mean, right now he's P10 in the standings, and also, a really talented crop of rookies joined the grid this year, I should say, and for him to stand out amongst those would have been a massive task, and he has done that. So it does feel like a no-brainer on Red Bull's side to make this decision. Obviously, it is probably the least wanted seat in some ways because of what's associated with it, but Hadjar has it's interesting. He changed his tune a lot, I think, with his attitude towards that seat. Earlier on in the season, he'd kind of played down some of the rumours around it, kind of saying, look, I still have a lot to learn, when he was first linked with a move to Red Bull, and he was like, I'm kind of happy where I am right now. But you could just tell that there was a bit of a change in how he was reacting to the question. Even when he was being asked, what is your going to be position next year, he was kind of already saying last week, I'm definitely going to be on the grid. And it seemed that he was very confident in his abilities. And I think what you touched on there, Lewis, the main thing is that he does have the raw speed too. It's not just that he can, handle the mental challenge that comes with being Max Verstappen's teammate. He's a very quick driver. He's pulled in some really, really good results there as well. And I mean, even to be getting such high praise from Helmut Marko this year, he has been very vocal in his support of Hadjar's progression this year as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how he matches up against Verstappen next year. He's obviously has the advantage of a clean slate with new cars as well. But let's talk about then, obviously, Racing Bulls, their decision, one, to keep Liam Lawson on. Obviously, he did those 2 races with Red Bull, which were frankly disastrous. And, it looked like his career could have been in massive jeopardy after being pushed down to that second team. But ultimately, he's handled himself quite well this year. And then to partner him up with Arvid Lindblad, quite an exciting prospect from Formula 2 this year. I mean, what are we to make of the Racing Bulls lineup heading into next year?
Yeah, well, firstly on Lawson, he had that disaster stint at Red Bull and really would have been difficult to recover from that. But he has recovered well at Racing Bulls and actually pulled together a pretty strong season, sort of to bounce back from that early setback. Again, showing great resilience and determination to sort of fight back. And kind of, as you touched on there a bit with Hadjar, actually, it just kind of proved that the reason why Hadjar probably wouldn't have wanted to get that seat this year at Red Bull is because the Racing Bulls cars are much nicer car to drive, and to extract the limit from it is obviously easier than the current Red Bull. But I think, again, it makes sense to keep hold of Lawson. Red Bull like to have sort of a solid known quantity in one of their seats, an experienced driver who's, guaranteed to sort of bring home those points. But also they've got a perfect yardstick there to balance and compare against Arvid Lindblad. And we've seen that before, that Yuki Tsunoda's kind of taken that role in for several years. For 4 seasons he was at the sister team, and he was kind of the one that was the benchmark. And now that role will be sort of taken over by Lawson. Lawson is not realistically going to return to Red Bull. I think it's quite clear now his role is to be the lead driver at Racing Bulls and sort of take over that position that Tsunoda held for several years. And I think there's no doubts that he's at home at Racing Bulls and he can do that job. Lindblad is an exciting young talent. He's highly rated. He's somebody that Red Bull are very excited about and sort of see as potentially being their next sort of superstar driver. So again, it makes sense to bring him through alongside an experienced teammate who Red Bull will have all the data for, not just at Racing Bulls. They'll have access to that data, but they'll also know what he can do in the Red Bull itself. So to have that kind of yardstick to compare how Lindblad's getting along will be really important, I think, for Red Bull. And Lindblad, he's only 18 years old. It'll be a very much a learning year for him next year. There's quite a job to follow up on what Hadjar's done, because there'll probably be quite a lot of expectation again on, as you said, there's a host of really talented rookies that have done a great job this year, and Lindblad's another exciting talent with a lot of hype around him. There'll be a bit of pressure next year in that sense, because
for sure
we've seen these rookies come in and perform from the off, and Hadjar's done such a great job this year that there'll almost be an expectation that Lindblad is doing similar next year already, because there's as we know, you just don't get the time in F1 these days, and you've kind of expected to perform right from the get-go. Otherwise, these opportunities pass you by. So it won't just be a nice, relaxed introductory year to F1. It never is when you're part of the Red Bull family. There'll be pressure and expectation, particularly with Helmut Marko keeping an eye on things, and he's not afraid to make comments. And I think he criticised Isack Hadjar after his debut race for the way he reacted to that. So
that's right. Yeah, a lot of people actually forget how critical he was to Hadjar in those early days, but he's kind of since changed his tune.
So it'll be similar for Lindblad, but he's coming in off after just one season in Formula 2. It's been a decent season. It wasn't particularly standout or hugely noteworthy. He's not in championship contention. He's currently 6th in the standings. There's obviously one race still to go this weekend. but he's picked up 2 victories this year. So there's been flashes of what he can do. Let's not forget he's only 18 as well. He won the Formula Regional Oceania Championship at the start of this year, and he also finished 4th in Formula 4 last season. So he's shown what he can do in the last couple of years. He's a promising young talent, and next on the sort of conveyor belt for Red Bull. And I guess he will be the next in line for that Red Bull drive, proving he obviously performs. I think Red Bull will be hoping that they don't have this same trouble that they've had this year, where Hadjar, for example, does not perform as expected as in a bad situation, and there's suddenly talk. Red Bull don't want to be in a situation 5 or 6 races into next year where there's already talk of, does Hadjar need to be replaced by Lindblad when he's only 6 races into his debut F1 season? I think they would really like that to work out well and have some stability there for at least a season, to both allow Hadjar to bed in at the main team and Lindblad to kind of get his bearings and learn his trade in Formula One in his first season in F1 too. But I think big pressure for both of them. But I think ultimately both moves make sense.
Yeah, it actually feels like Red Bull have been quite wise, because they've been subject to a lot of criticism over their driver lineups over the last few years, and they've had so much stability until really Max Verstappen joined that team. And ultimately there was a time when they had a really strong lineup with himself and Daniel Ricciardo, and then there was this sort of domino effect with Gasly and then Albon struggling, and then you always had kind of Kvyat in the background kind of huddling between the two teams as well. So this kind of feels like a return to the kind of very early stability that Red Bull had with those two families, having a decent kind of bench of drivers that they can tap into as well. But as you said, Lewis, it does remain to be seen as to how Hadjar does perform. So there is a lot of pressure on those drivers too. And look, ultimately, I think Liam Lawson will be happy to still have a place on the grid next year. I think he's been somewhat kind of maybe humbled is too harsh a word, but he obviously came in with a lot of confidence and was dropped down. And I think how he's handled himself in that second team has been, really, really impressive and commendable. And I think he'll be happy to even just remain on the grid. And I think also the possibilities that do open with that are there. There was this kind of opinion, I think, a few years ago that when you were on that second Red Bull team, if you didn't get the promotion to the top team, you ultimately were just going to stay on that team for a limited amount of time and then maybe leave the grid. But we've had people like Gasly break the mold there and move across. Even Albon has, made a really phenomenal jump across to Williams. And this is where Red Bull's strength is. They do have a knack for picking out really good young talent. If anything, they were kind of the first team to do that. Now, obviously, all the other teams do have kind of driver academies, and McLaren is, collecting more and more younger drivers and things like that. But this is definitely a good move from them. But we do have to talk, Lewis, about Yuki Tsunoda. I mean, I think you had said in some previous podcasts that, his position on the grid was pretty much gone. It looked very, very likely that was going to happen, and ultimately that he's going to remain in the Red Bull family as an F1 junior. But I mean, ultimately, without the backing from Honda next year and his performance, all things considered, it probably was only going to go one way with Yuki, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the most surprising aspect of this is that Yuki's actually stayed part of the Red Bull family, and believe there's been some reports that this is because they've sort of thrashed out a deal with Honda, even though Honda are moving away from Red Bull and won't be supplying their engines. It seems like some sort of deal's been done there, potentially to help out with the testing of previous cars. They might still supply the engines to Red Bull, so that would give Yuki some running potentially there in an older car throughout the year. So that was interesting, because I think there was a bit of an expectation that he might just disappear altogether, or maybe try and end up somewhere else. It does make sense, obviously, for Red Bull to have that reliable, I say reliable-ish, like they know what they've got there with Tsunoda. They do need a reserve driver, obviously, because, if something were to happen to Max Verstappen or to Isack Hadjar now, they will need somebody to step in. So it's important that they have a solid backup, and they've got that in Yuki Tsunoda. I thought more surprising would be Yuki's willingness to stay at Red Bull and stay within the family when it's quite clear that his future at Red Bull is done. I don't think there's any way back into the, unless Hadjar has an absolute disaster, but it would have to be, something something we couldn't imagine right now. For them to even think about putting Tsunoda back in, considering how much he struggled. Barring that, I just don't see Tsunoda having a future at Red Bull. So a little bit surprised that he's maybe decided to take on that position as reserve driver. It makes sense for Red Bull's point of view. It does. The one thing that does make sense from Tsunoda is that it keeps him within the F1 paddock. It keeps him within the F1 bubble, and that could potentially help him secure a lifeline for 2027 when the driver market over the next 12 months is likely to explode. There could be openings here, there, and everywhere at most teams, to be honest. 2026 was a bit of a most teams wanted to keep their lineup sort of stable for next year with the new regulations, and then things could really shake up in 2027. So as you touched upon there, we've seen it before with both Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly, and we've seen it with other cases too of drivers having that year out. Daniel Ricciardo as well dropped back into that reserve role at Red Bull, and that ultimately helped secure a full-time return in the following year. So I think a year on the sidelines probably won't do Tsunoda any harm to kind of regroup and recover from what was a pretty brutal season, with an eye of return to the grid, because he is a very solid, capable Grand Prix driver. Let's not forget that. Like, it wasn't that long ago that we were singing Tsunoda's praises in the sister team for doing pulling out, okay, not a podium, but the kind of consistent performances as the lead driver that Hadjar has shown this year. But then stepping up to Red Bull, it's a different ball game altogether, and we could see similar with Hadjar. Hopefully not, because hopefully the new rules will give that kind of reset. But yeah, it's interesting to see where Tsunoda ends up. I think there's probably a decent chance of him returning to the grid in 2027, and I think that will be his main priority next year. Will be to try and line up those cards. There's obviously an obvious potential link is Aston Martin, as they've got the Honda Works deal from next year, and obviously being Tsunoda's backers, there's a clear link there. I think the biggest problem is, if Fernando Alonso leaves, there's only really one opening at Aston Martin, and that's if Alonso decides to go, and then it would make perfect sense from Tsunoda. It'd be a great move for him. Not sure Aston Martin would necessarily see Tsunoda as being that top tier caliber driver that they would want to sort of take over from Alonso with the view to winning world championships, lining up with their ambitions, particularly when there could be drivers like Max Verstappen, potentially George Russell, maybe even Oscar Piastri up for grabs. And you'd think that they would rather go with somebody like that if they're looking to replace Fernando Alonso, because we're assuming that Lance Stroll is kind of at Aston Martin forevermore until he decides he's had enough. So that's potentially an opening, but there'll be other openings too. You look at the likes of Alpine, potentially Haas. A lot of talk about Oliver Behrman being promoted to Ferrari in 2027. If Lewis Hamilton, if things didn't go well for Ferrari next year and Hamilton perhaps walked away, perhaps there's an opening at a team like Haas or even Alpine, where Franco Colapinto has got another year, but he really needs to prove himself next year. There won't be any sort of hiding place there. And again, Alpine could be potentially an option for Yuki Tsunoda in the future, and possibly linking up again with Pierre Gasly, his former AlphaTauri teammate, as it were then.
Yeah, wouldn't that be a sight? I mean, I think he's in a kind of a weird, awkward position where he's done quite a few years now in Formula One, and as you said, Lewis, sometimes that year out can be really beneficial, and he's staying adjacent to the kind of Formula One grid pretty much throughout it, which we saw really helped the likes of even Valtteri Bottas make a return with Cadillac next year, and we also don't know what direction they'll go in the next few years too as well. They've got a really solid driver lineup, but they are older. Ultimately, how much longer they want to spend on the grid as well is a big question there. So I think Yuki is a really safe pair of hands in some ways too, and he's really experienced at this point. And I mean, ultimately, I hate to see him drop off the grid, but with Formula One, a lot of these things are timing as well. And I guess what's working slightly against him is the fact that there is always top talent coming up through the ranks and ready to take that new seat. But there is other things that could play into his hands. As you said, Lewis, I think next year's driver market is going to be extremely volatile. That usually when you have this kind of static year the prior, the next one is always absolutely crazy, and then adding that other team onto the grid as well will add a little bit of kind of interest to that mix and some opportunities there as well. But ultimately, he is in a little bit of an awkward position, but it's probably the right thing for him to do to stay F1 adjacent and not completely, because we know how hard it is to get back into the sport sometimes when you've been out of it for too long. And actually, I think next year is a bit of an outlier with the likes of Bottas and Perez returning, obviously with a new team joining the grid. But there's going to be lots to watch there over the next 12 months. Well, thanks very much for joining me, Lewis. Keep up to date with us on Crash.net as we head into the final round in Abu Dhabi next weekend. Thanks for listening, guys.